Rick Broniec is the vibrant relationships guy. He believes in the incredible power of passionate, authentic, vibrant relationships to connect people and promote healing and productivity. Rick's keynote on the 7 generations story and incentive for healing connect Rick's 25 years of healing and personal growth work with his Native American heritage. It is my pleasure to present Mr. Rick Broniec.
If you looked at my last name, you'd think I was Polish or German, and you'd be right. But 1/8 of my heritage is Native American. I'm actually Cherokee Indian. I made an attempt some years ago to get in touch with that part of my heritage, just kind of reclaim it, because it was a family secret. I did that by doing a lot of reading, by attending powwows, Native American encampments, talking to shamans, and I did dozens of sweats and other ceremonies. One of the delightful things I learned about my heritage, some of the philosophy, was this piece of philosophy called the 7 generations. The concept here is tightly woven into Native American mythology, that the ancestors are so tightly connected throughout history that what happens to one of us affects many of us, particularly within a family. The concept is that if I do something positive or negative in my life, but today we're going to talk about the positive, it will affect 7 generations of my family, very possibly. Now, it's clear to see that when I do something, it can affect my children, perhaps my grandchildren, maybe my great-grandchildren. It might be harder to understand how what I do could affect my parents, my grandparents, or even my great-grandparents who I'd never met. I found this to be a fascinating concept. If it were true, would it give you and me a deeper incentive to do positive things in your life? Would it give you a more poignant reason to do some healing, to do some personal growth, or maybe some spiritual work that might impact your family, in fact, could change your whole family's story? Think about that for a minute. I have. And I want to share with you today some stories about some generations in my family and how my work perhaps has impacted them. You ready for that?
Yes.
Thank you. I was going to do it anyhow. So I'll start with me. When I was 37 years old, some 25 years ago, I'm sad to say, I was a very successful chemistry teacher in Racine, Wisconsin, just down the road from here. I was the department chair. I won several national and state teaching awards. I was on the board of directors of several important science teaching organizations. I was very well known. I've been on television and so forth. At the same time, I'd been a minister in my church for 20 years. I was a father of 2 precious daughters. At that time, they were 5 and 3 years old. And of course, I was a husband, a sibling, a son, and a grandson. Despite all of that seeming richness in my life, at that time in my life, I was a very unhappy man. I felt unfulfilled. I felt like I didn't deserve all the success that was coming to me, and I was not able to express the truth of who I was. I was living behind a very finely crafted mask, a facade, if you will, of perfectionism, of inability to be authentic or vulnerable in any way. I found out later that was part of my family's story that I was taught and acculturated to very strongly. Well, things in my marriage got tense, things in other places in my life got tense, and eventually I was dragged kicking and screaming. And my friends, I do mean kicking and screaming, into therapy. Because the Broniec family does not do therapy, and we certainly don't talk about our feelings. Despite my resistance to this therapeutic relationship, it actually was tremendously important to me. And to this day, I continue to do therapeutic work in my life, healing work, and I promise you I will do it the rest of my life. The therapeutic relationship led me into 12-step work, led me deeply into men's work, into couples work, and those are things that I have gotten so much from that I continue to do those today. One of the things I discovered early on in my work was this concept of this mask that I was hiding behind, that I didn't even know. I had no clue. I thought that was the real me. People in my life knew it wasn't the real me, but I did not. I began the hard work of peeling off that mask and beginning to show the world the reality of who I was. That meant I had to become more vulnerable. That meant I had to become more real. That meant I had to start expressing some feelings. And while it was difficult and painful at times, it was also very rewarding. During that same time, I began to realize that I was passing on to my daughters, my precious daughters who I love so much, exactly the same negative messages and belief systems that my parents and grandparents had passed on to me. I caught myself saying and doing the exact things to my children that I swore I'd never do to them. Anybody else ever had that experience where something leaves your mouth, particularly towards loved ones, and you go, oh my God, I can't believe I said that. I sound just like my mother, or just like my father, or my grandfather, or whoever. I'm glad I'm not alone. So that raised the incentive once again for me to continue to do my work because I didn't want to pass that stuff on to my daughters and my granddaughters. Also during this period in my life, I became quite aware of a very large sort of hole or wound in my life that a men's work icon, Robert Bly, calls the father wound. The father wound is an almost universal wound that men in our culture and cultures all over the world experience. It often comes from either not having our fathers in our homes at all, or them being so emotionally distant that we never experienced a deep, emotionally satisfying, authentic connection with our fathers. Many, many men carry that. Women, not so much with their mothers. It's pretty universal for men. As I explored that, I realized that my father wound was qualitatively different than most men. I was lucky in that my father actually was quite emotionally available. He was a very loving man. He told me and my siblings often that he cared for us, that he loved us, and that he was proud of us. That was a huge gift. So what was my wound? What was I missing? I realized that what I was missing from my father was the other side of the equation. What were his challenges? What were his regrets, his mistakes? You see, my father lost his father when he was just 13 years old. At that time, during the Depression and right before World War II, his family was in desperate straits. So at 13 years old, my father went to work to help support his mother and his brother. And he didn't stop working until 65 years old, 52 years later. He went into sales. He became highly successful at that. He loved it. He was very, very good at it. And he had that salesman's persona, can-do attitude, positivity, always had a smile on his face. Never had anything negative to say about anybody. And then it hit me. I was exactly like him. I was my father's son. I had that same persona. And what I realized through the work I was doing is that it was killing me. And it was hurting my family, my partner, my wife, my children, and even my parents. So I began that hard work. And I realized that I needed to have a conversation with my dad. A real conversation where we probed behind the salesman persona, and I got to see a little bit more of who he was. So in the spring of 1991, I approached my father. I said, Dad, I'd love to have some time, just you and me. Now, in my very large family, this was unheard of. So my dad said, well, great, bring your brothers up and we'll go fishing. I said, no, Dad, just you and me. For 6 months, I gently made this invitation to my father. Now, he knew something was going on with me. He was aware that I was doing some kind of crazy growth work, and I was changing. I was changing the way I related to my father, my mother, my partner, and to my children. I think he was a little scared of who I was becoming and what was going on with me. And I also suspect he was a little intimidated. So it took 6 months for him to respond. Finally, in August of 1991, I got a call from my dad. Hey, Rick, how'd you like to go fishing, just you and me for a few days? I said, great idea, Dad. Let's do it. And we had precious, precious time together, 4 days. During that time, we'd get up in the morning, go fishing all day long, come back in the late afternoon, clean and cook our catch, have a great meal, and we sit around the campfire and begin to talk. My dad began to share things that he'd never shared with me before. I knew, for example, that when his father died, my dad had given up his dream of becoming a musician. Music was his passion. He was a savant. He could pick up any instrument, and in 5 minutes he'd be playing it as if he was an expert. He particularly loved the big band music, the Dorsey Band and so forth, in Chicago that was very popular in the 1940s and 50s. In fact, my parents met at a Benny Goodman concert in the Crystal Ballroom in Chicago, Illinois in 1949 and danced together for the first time. And they were married in that very same place. He had to give up that dream, however, of becoming a music teacher, going to college, because he thrust himself into the role of provider at 13 years of age and all the way to 65. On the last day of our time together, I believe that I was able to create enough safety. I listened to my dad so deeply enough, non-judgmentally enough, and asked enough questions where he was able to finally get to the point where he could share that story that he'd never shared before. He said, Rick, when my dad died, on the day of his funeral, my uncle came to my mother, his sister, and said, you can't take care of Bill anymore. I'll take him under my wing, and I'll clothe him and feed him until you get back on your feet. Of course, his mother, my grandmother, said, thank you. Then my father turned to me very matter-of-factly, and he said, and that was the first night my uncle had sex with me. Needless to say, I was stunned. I was overwhelmed. And I began to cry in empathy for my father. I couldn't believe that he'd held on to that story for over 50 years. He'd never told anyone, not his mother and not my mother. I reached across and I grabbed my father's hand and I said, Dad, what did you do with that? How did you survive that? How did you heal from that? And he said, Rick, I did what men and women did in those days. I stuffed it way deep down, and I never talked about it again until this moment. That night I had the privilege of holding my father while he sobbed and talked about the impact of this event on his life that he'd never shared before. It was one of those magical moments, as you can well imagine. I invite you to take a deep breath with me, my friends. I know this is hard to hear, but it's part of my history. The next morning, as we packed up and got ready to leave, my father turned to me and he said, I haven't felt this good in a long time, Rick. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for holding me. I needed that. I feel fantastic. Just 2 weeks after that time, I received a letter from my father that I still have today. Periodically, I pull it out, I unfold it, and I read it, and I have another good cry with my dad. In that letter, he thanked me for the time together. He noted the personal growth that I had done and praised it. It no longer intimidated him. He realized how powerful it was. And he said, you made it possible for me to share something that's been eating at me for 50 years. Thank you. I am so grateful I have that letter, and so grateful I persisted to have that time with my father. Because just 3 months later, the day after Christmas, 1991, my father died unexpectedly of heart failure. Yes, his heart, I believe, literally broke from holding that story in for so long. And yet I know that he did some healing with me because I was able to create a space for that with him because of my own healing. Take another deep breath, please. Now I'd like to share a story about my own daughter, Heather. Heather's my youngest. She's 27 years old today. She just graduated from college with a degree in hospital administration and nursing, and she is brilliant. I call her my shame-free child. Why? Because when Heather was born, about the same time my wife and I began to do our own healing work, our own work of peeling off our facades. And we weren't putting our shame on her like we used to, like we had done in the past. So she'd spill a glass of milk at lunch and just say, oh, I spilled a glass of milk. It's okay, I'll clean it up. Get a rag, clean it up, sit down, eat her lunch like nothing happened. There was no drama, no histrionics, no tears. It was stunning. I look at my wife, she looked at me. We'd go, wow, that's amazing. It's real different than our households. We were both raised in alcoholic environments. My daughter Heather attracted a beautiful husband and has two unbelievably beautiful granddaughters, my granddaughters. Jada, age 5, and Kiana, age 3. And they are so alive and so juicy and joyful, I can't believe it. Last year, I was on the phone with Jada, who at that time was 4 years old. Jada was babbling like 4-year-olds can about their life and all the great things that were happening. By the way, how many of you have grandchildren? I have quite a few of you. Aren't they wonderful? Isn't it great to play with your grandchildren, and when they get cranky, when they get tired, when they get stinky, just hand it back to mom and dad? Isn't that great? I think this is God's payback for surviving our own parenting experiences. That's what I believe. Back to my call. I'm with Jada on the phone, and she's going on and on, all excited about this and that grandpa and this grandpa and that grandpa. And my heart was so full of love and appreciation for this precious being. I stopped her and I said, Jada, do you know how precious you are to Grandpa? And without missing a beat, she said, yes, Grandpa, I'm amazing. She said, I'm amazing. And again, I was stunned. Once again, tears came out of my eyes. I mean, they poured out of my eyes. This time it wasn't tears of grief. It was tears of intense joy and gratitude. And at the moment I hung up that phone with Jada, I had this gestalt, this moment of clarity, bringing back to my 7-generation story, that my granddaughter didn't have to fight through a lot of things that my generation did. That she was raised in a shame-free environment. Can you imagine when you were 4 years old, saying to the big people in your life, I'm amazing and surviving? I can't. I couldn't even think of those words in those days. And if I'd said it, I would have got smacked down very hard by my parents, my grandparents, and my aunts and uncles for that matter. But she was able to do it. And I was able to say to her, yes, you are, Jada, and I love you very much. That gestalt was that I have an influence on the generations of my family. Maybe 7 of them, I don't know. I know I've affected my dad and my mom and their generation. I know I've affected my daughter and my granddaughters. And I know my great-granddaughters are going to be awesome as well. Now, you don't have to be Native American or believe in the 7-generation story to get something of value out of what I'm sharing today. I hope that if you're doing some personal growth work, whatever it looks like for you, that you continue it. The value is unmistakable. And it will impact, I believe, the generations of your family. Notice that, pay attention. And if you're not, I invite you to dip your toe in or jump into the deep end of the pool with me if you'd like, and try it out. See what happens. I believe that day on the phone, my precious, brilliant 4-year-old granddaughter, Jada, stumbled upon a powerful and important truth. one that I believe at the very core of my being, my soul. Not only is she amazing, but we all are. You are amazing. You have precious gifts to offer. You're magnificent. You are incredible, and you have stories to tell. I believe that firmly. I hope you do too.